Hey everyone, in this episode of the HR Investigations Podcast, we're pulling back the curtain on how technology is transforming the way HR and employee relations teams handle investigations. From airtight documentation and evidence security to the rise of AI and analytics, discover how solutions like Case IQ are helping organizations protect data, reduce risk, and uncover the insights needed to drive real cultural change.
Welcome to the HR Investigations Podcast, exploring the issues, challenges, strategies, and solutions. Sponsored by RPCHR and hosted by Natalie Ivy, an HR consultant, licensed PI, and author of the best-selling book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for human resource professionals. And now, here's Natalie.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the HR Investigations Podcast, where we explore the real issues, challenges, strategies, and solutions HR professionals face when handling internal investigations. I'm your host, Natalie Ivy. Today we're diving into a topic that's reshaping the way HR and employee relations teams work: technology. We're going to talk about how documentation, security, AI, and analytics are redefining investigations, making them not only more efficient, but also more defensible. To help us unpack this, I am joined by Jakub Ficner. He is the Director of Partnership at Case IQ, and Case IQ is a leading provider of case management software, helping organizations manage sensitive investigations with security, consistency, and intelligence. Jakub, welcome to the show. It is really great to have you here.
Well, to start, thanks for having me, Natalie. My name is Jakub Ficner. I'm a Global Account Director and Director of Partnerships at Case IQ. I've been part of the team now for 16 years, specializing in internal investigation. So that's working with HR, ER, LR, and ethics and compliance teams to provide a process-driven approach and a better way to handling, documenting, and ultimately learning from all their investigative data.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I told you he's a seasoned guy. All right. Well, let's start with the foundation. Investigations really do succeed or fail on documentation. Why is accurate and timely documentation so critical, not just for compliance, but also for protecting the organization?
That's a great question. And ultimately, documentation is more than just paperwork. It's your defense. Documentation is the only objective record of what happened, who said what, and why decisions were made. In court, arbitration, or regulatory reviews, documentation is often the only line of defense that an organization has. One thing I heard several years back by an HR professional was that in HR, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So ultimately, we're building a foundation of trust and transparency. Thorough factual notes show consistency and fairness, and we find that vague documentation can lead to eroded confidence and create perceptions of bias that I'll touch on later. And it's also continuity and institutional memory. So we know that investigations can ultimately span weeks or months. And the example I use now is if an investigator wins the lottery, what happens? What was said? When was it communicated? Organizations are ultimately at a loss and on the back foot if ever they have to defend what happened on that case. And then lastly, better decision-making and reporting. So being able to structure your data, document your data, you can ultimately learn from your data and take a more proactive approach. So if we look at examples, oftentimes I'll see poorly documented notes where we'll see employee complaint received, spoke to both parties, resolved. And if we shift to a better, well-documented one, we want to see dates, times, interview notes, supporting docs, policy reference, and ultimately rationale for outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was it. You hit on some of the things that I was going to ask you about as common mistakes. And these are some of the things that I talk about all the time. And my listeners have heard me say this numerous times: dates, times, and details. And if you don't give me that, I'm really kind of at a loss. And you know what? Legal is going to be too, right? Not a good.
Sure.
Yeah. And, so Jakub, this is really where technology can help, right? And I'd like you to explain how a platform like Case IQ helps HR teams standardize that documentation so that every case file really is consistent, thorough, and, as you said, defensible.
So ultimately, it's about building a process and being able to consistently follow that process. When we find organizations, and I'm still amazed by some large multinational organizations when they first come to us, are still tracking their investigations in spreadsheets. And that really doesn't give you a good foundation for first documenting the case and then ultimately being able to defend or learn from that case. And so when we look at how we can help and the risks that come from it, one is accidental exposure. An Excel document is not secure. Everyone has access to it. And one wrong CC can lead to sensitive information being disclosed to the wrong parties. There's also no chain of custody. So altered, deleted files, they can't be defended. It has weak security controls. So shared folders, who has access to it? When did they access it? And a single missaved file can turn a confidential investigation into tomorrow's headline.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to tell you, attorneys get really unhappy when they've now lost privilege. Right? When you have attorney-client privilege, you've been maintaining it, and then, somebody decides they're going to go take some documents and they inadvertently CC several people. You've blown it, right? You've lost your privilege. Yep.
And that's exactly it. So when we look at Case IQ and some of the key benefits and how we help organizations, there's role-based security. So only assigned users have access to that particular matter. And then we learn there's always exceptions to that. So it's really hard to come up with a general set of rules. So you can add conditions to matters such as restricted, confidential, litigation hold, and privilege that would further restrict access to those matters so that, again, the appropriate people see that information. It's about securing evidence. Everything is encrypted, it's tracked, it's associated to cases. So you have a single source of truth for all of your investigative data, all of your notes, your files, your emails, your correspondence. I'm not having to go through shared folders or individual Outlook inboxes or desktop folders. It's all secured within a single easy-to-use case records. And then strong security controls and audit trails. Yeah. So you see everything from case views to field level changes, storing the before and after status. So when we look at Excel, I see that challenge quite often is, well, we don't know who had access to the case or who made what change, why they made it, when they made it. And when an auditor comes knocking or a regulator comes knocking, how do you defend your stance if you're just relying on spreadsheets and folders?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of using some standardization. And I've talked about this in my books. I've been talking about it in my programs that I deliver on teaching people how to investigate properly in the workplace. And so, amen, brother. All right. So now let's talk about what can happen with maybe data breaches, the legal exposure, reputational damage. Do you have any examples maybe where mishandling evidence or files caused maybe a major issue for an organization? Of course, without breaching any confidentiality, but anything that you could share as maybe a lesson learned for our audience?
Yeah, well, I see it as twofold. One is just lack of documentation, and two is the security around the documentation that organizations may have. And there's a stat. So according to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, up to 40% of internal investigations fail to uncover misconduct because evidence is incomplete or mishandled. Mm-hmm. So that means poor documentation or weak controls don't just create external risk, they leave serious misconduct hidden inside the organization. And in terms of securing the data, there's a lot of publicly known examples or cases like Ambulance Victoria from Australia, where an ex-employee walked out with HR data, Corrective Services, NSW. So 80 staff health harassment files accidentally were emailed, and that caused reputational damage. And then there's a case with H&M when they had a $35 million GDPR fine for mishandling employee data.
Yeah.
And what we find is that ultimately, if employees don't trust HR to protect their information, they won't raise concerns. And that silence is the biggest risk of all.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah. And when it comes to kind of your standard employee relations cases, if you're handling like EEO kinds of things, one of the things that our attorney has always said, his name is Sean, and he's a partner with a law firm here in Orlando. He always says, better to handle problems in-house rather than at the courthouse. right? That's always going to be a lot less expensive. So, investing in some procedures to ensure that you never, ever have that gap is always going to be a better play.
For sure. And what we find is spreadsheets and emails are like unlocked desk drawers. And so ultimately for us, it's about adding encryption, access controls, and audit trails because one breach can undo years of HR credibility.
Yeah, it sure can. And when employees don't really feel like HR has the credibility, or even your employee relations or ethics team or labor relations team, they're going to go elsewhere, which means they're going to be much more inclined to file with a regulatory agency, whether it be the EEOC or a state agency. Yeah. All right, now, Jakub, let's talk a little bit about AI. All right, that's a big buzzword right now, but when it comes to HR investigations, I'd like you to share with our listeners, how's AI actually being used to help investigators?
So this is definitely something that is near and dear to my heart and an exciting topic to just generally talk about since everybody has open ears in terms of AI. And we're lucky enough to be in an environment where we were early adopters within AI and had investments from Microsoft to become cloud innovation partners in the AI space. And it's ultimately for us about how can we leverage AI securely and privately within organizations' most sensitive cases. And there are a lot of different ways in terms of how organizations, specifically HR, are leveraging AI to improve their operations. So it started off in terms of our evolution with summarization. What we found was cases. There's a lot of notes, there's a lot of files and correspondence, and they can span a considerable amount of time, like previous said, weeks or months. And an investigator might be handling multiple cases at a time. So things can easily fall between the cracks when I'm getting to that outcome or disposition stage and trying to defend said outcome. And so summarization gave us a tool that enabled organizations to instantly create brief or detailed summaries based on all the case information. AI doesn't forget. It can go through all the information and summarize it instantly. Great for that investigator at the end of the long investigation, or even if I'm a manager or leadership, and instead of me bugging my employees, hey, what's going on in this case? I can just ask the AI to summarize everything. And since our record contains all those notes, files, emails, I've got up-to-date, real-time summarization on all the cases that my employees or my organization is currently dealing with. And where it evolved is being able to build on top of that. So it evolved to timelines and suggestions. So timeline's great to be able to go through all the case information and create a chronological timeline of all the events and entries. And suggestions was a really powerful one, as it allowed organizations to link to policies, procedures, regulations, and playbooks, and being able to guide a consistent process. Everything from assessment, when that case lands on your desk, being able to instantly assess that case on, this is potentially a conflict of interest, these are the policy violations that might be at play, and these are our suggested next steps, as it has access to all of your information. And then where it evolved is even things like suggestions on next steps and outcomes. So this is most likely, based on all the information gathered, a company violation, and our recommended next steps are X, Y, and Z. And now we're really excited to enter phase 3 of our AI evolution, where we're introducing Claria to our clients, which is an AI virtual assistant. And that's ultimately arming investigators with the ability to reduce all that administrative burden. You can ask the AI questions. So examples, summarize the interview between the reporter and the subject and look for discrepancies and craft follow-up questions for each party. And the AI will instantly summarize that for you and create a prompt. Or generate an email that is a response to this recipient. And it generates that draft and it can hit the ground running. What we found is investigators hate at the end of an investigation, ultimately being forced to create all this documentation and that administrative burden. And ultimately, we hear quite often, I'm not a writer. I didn't get into this to ultimately be a writer. And they're spending 40% of their time writing and documenting. So if I can offload that information to the AI and have it do the initial writing for me, I can do more value add activity by being able to spend my time actually investigating.
Yes, I love it. I love it. I love it. And from my perspective, Jacob, because I've been an educator on this subject for many, many years, when I pose scenarios a lot of times to students in my classes, they will struggle with being able to look at a situation. I give them a case example to delve into, and then I'll say, okay, please give me an example of, how that behavior is in violation of this policy. Can you correlate that for me? And sometimes I'll even go very vague and I'll say, okay, tell me which of the organization's policies, here is the manual, which of the policies could potentially be implicated. And there's often that kind of proverbial deer in the headlights. They stumble. They have a very difficult time correlating behaviors to policy. And now what your organization has done has really created super fast shortcuts using AI. I am loving it. And also the summary piece, and also being able to synthesize that information and do it very quickly. That is an inordinate amount of time when you're an investigator, especially a complex case. In some of them that I've worked over the years, you have many, many witnesses. I had one not long ago that we had 18 witnesses. That was a whopper of a case, and that takes time. And now these are really just slick tools that are making our lives just so much easier and also improving the work product.
And that's a great example. Like in that example, you have 18 involved parties, potentially 18 interviews, if not more. At the end of an investigation, you might not remember who said what, when they said it, and what interview. The AI has instant access to all that information. The other thing that we find the AI our application is extremely good at is looking for bias. So going back to a previous challenge cited, bias is something that organizations are actively looking to eliminate as it presents a legal risk to them. And AI is really good to scan through all the notes and narratives and let the investigator know if any bias is potentially present there.
Oh, I can tell you legal's going to be like doing the Snoopy happy dance over that, because that is something that they worry about all the time. All right, awesome. So you've done a great job of really giving some examples of how AI really supports HR, ER, ethics teams in their work. Also, can you share with me maybe any situations where the AI insights in your software helped uncover maybe a trend or a systemic issue that HR might have missed without having that level of analysis?
So from a starting point, it's early detection. The tool, as an example, can let you know if there's any relevant cases that might be related to your case. Mm-hmm. And in those examples, as soon as something lands on my desk, I can know, hey, is there any other cases that we've previously worked on that might be related to my case? So we can take an example like the U.S. Olympic Committee and their scandals, and it ultimately prevents that, as I'll know right away if a coach or a doctor has had previous allegations made against them. And then when it does land on your desk, a consistent assessment process. Mm-hmm. So going through all that information and letting you know this is most likely a potential policy violation, that allows you to focus your time on the cases that matter. We see quite often workloads are raising. There's more cases and traditionally less investigators. So an investigator's handling more cases, and that's true for Q coordinators in terms of assessing those cases. I log in the morning, I've got 10 cases I need to review. Where do I start? Where do I focus my time? The AI can assist you in knowing which cases warrant your further deep dive review. And then lastly, outcomes. Being able to learn from that information. So are we consistently applying recommended corrective actions across an organization? Are we potentially seeing any bias in the way that we are applying corrective actions across demographics, gender, race, whatever it might be? And AI has access to that information, and ultimately it's unbiased. So we still find it doesn't replace HR. So AI, it ultimately is here to amplify it. It drafts reports, spots patterns, and manages workflows.
Yes, absolutely. And the other piece that I really love is just the case management analytics. When you can look back on the trends. Okay, why is it that we have 3 quarters in a row that our Northeast division has had the highest number of sexual harassment allegations? And why is it that we see that these two particular leaders are the common denominator, right? That kind of stuff. And that is that really great deep dive. The other piece that also I want to kind of revert back to our discussion about Excel sheets, right? I realize that budgets can be tight and, professionals still rely on kind of those spreadsheets. And it's one of those, well, we've always done it that way. Okay, well, as I have often shared, well, what if we were using Windows 98 in the current 2025 operating environment? It isn't going to work very well, right? And so those of you that are so kind of married to those Excel sheets, we really have got to up our game because we're growing, expanding. Even some of the smaller organizations that here at my company at RPC that we work with, they're growing. They're acquiring other companies. You have employees who move around. And if you really don't have the historical data, well, then who is that HR manager coming in behind you? How in the world is that HR manager going to know the history of maybe 2 or 3 bad actors? They don't know where these files are buried in some stupid shared folder that, unfortunately is accessible by too many people and that kind of stuff. We've got to have a much, much better kind of 2025 process heading into 26 here, instead of just a file folder here, an Excel sheet there, Word document here, Manila file folder there, right? We have got to evolve. And, this is also part of building an organization's culture, because if you think about it from where the employees are sitting, they know who the bad actors are, right? They know. And they wonder, how does this person continue to just keep their job? Well, they might be moved around from different places. Yeah, they just get investigated, no evidence. Okay, case inconclusive. Then maybe 6 months later, this employee, will call him Fred. Fred moves on to another division of the company. All right, in not too terribly long period of time. Now Fred is kind of repeating a bad behavior. Gets investigated, but that investigator has no knowledge of the first one in the previous division or facility he worked in, right? And I'm just picking, Fred and a guy randomly. I've had many cases where, there are individuals as subjects who are the ladies that, let's just say, they can be bad actors just as much, right? So I'm really a fan of the dashboards and the analytics, to not just also be reactive to issues, but really getting ahead of them and looking at the health of the organization. Are we really walking the talk with our organization's values? And are we being true north to our mission? In some cases, the data is going to tell you maybe not so much, right? Let's talk now about turning that data into action. How can HR use some of the insights from investigations to influence things like policy updates, or maybe even training programs, or even those broader cultural changes? Jakub, I'd like to hear from your perspective.
Well, I'm definitely glad you touched on organizational health, since that's something we preach here as well. And ultimately, dashboards turn isolated cases into panoramic view of workplace health. So I can go in and I can spot trends much earlier than later. I am, again, still amazed by these large multinational organizations that first engage with us. And the HR leader can't tell me how many cases they have across various locations, states, let alone different countries. Mm-hmm. And so step one is ultimately, let's centralize that data. Let's secure it. Let's structure it, and then learn from that data. And what we always say is it's a journey. Organizations, you can't get to the last and final stage of investigative data maturity without taking the steps to get there. So let's go on this journey together. Let's structure data. Let's start with simple stats and trends if you're not being able to do that. But that's only step one. It's an evolution. From there, let's pull in more information to supplement that general, what was reported and why it was reported, to what were our disciplinary actions, what were our recommended corrective actions, what were our timelines of each workflow step to look for process improvements. Mm-hmm. And then from there evolve to contributing factors or root cause analysis. So at a case level, let's start analyzing that information, because then as we aggregate that data, we have now a wealth of information to learn from, and it can identify risks before they escalate to full-blown scandals. So we always tell clients, throw in everything into the system. We even recommend tracking general HR requests in our system. They'll be categorized differently, but that gives you a pulse. If I see a spike of questions coming in from a location or region about a specific policy like sexual harassment, that can notify me that there might be something going there. And typically we say where there's smoke, there's typically fire. So it allows you to focus your effort in terms of the areas that are ultimately the most risky to your organization. So the first element is that it's about being able to evolve to a more proactive, preventative stance. So in arming our clients with that ability. The other one that you touched on is budgets are finite, especially in today's client. And so HR historically might have been seen as a cost center, and they weren't using the same data to prove their value to leadership that other departments like sales, marketing, and operations have been using for years.
Right.
So they're coming to a gunfight looking for budget with a knife. So ultimately for us, it's being, how do you prove that you are contributing value to the organization, that you are showing a return on investment and ultimately reducing the overall risk and cost of the organization. And so it's being able to present that journey to the client and take it together where they're taking a preventative stance and ultimately then they're using data to show the value of their department. Since if I see that spike, an example from one of our clients, LA Metro was able to use the study or the data to show a spike in a specific occurrence that they were targeting with specific teams and units. They were then able to apply their limited training budget to those specific teams and units, and then be able to show the effectiveness of their training through a reduction of those occurrences relative to the population that wasn't trained. And so just with that step-by-step process, they're showing that there's more value in what they do and the training and enablement and policy recommendations that they provide than just check marks in a compliance checklist.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think the other element that you talked about earlier is that cases are increasing, but not necessarily investigators. And I've been sounding the alarm on this for quite some time. And one of the things that I think is absolutely paramount for our listening audience is you have to really document where your time is being spent and how much is it taking, not necessarily perhaps investigations. Yes, you need to be documenting how long does it take you to prep for an interview? How long is each interview? How long does it take you to perhaps reach out and try to obtain a piece of evidence? Maybe you have to reach out 2-3 times with accounting until someone finally gets back to you because you're trying to get a copy of an expense report, right? That's one thing. And of course, we need to document that. But what about all of the other stuff? What about all of the other employee relations issues? And how much time are you spending on each one of those inquiries? If you're not really accounting for where your time is going, but your team just keeps going year after year after year, where your volume of your issues continues to climb, but the headcount in your department stays the same. If you have no analytics to support where you are spending your time and that your team is really stretched thin, all you're doing is going and pleading your case with anecdotal evidence to your leadership. Just, oh, my team is just overwhelmed. Well, show me, right? And if you don't really have the show me, you don't really have the leverage to be able to influence the meaningful change, to negotiate for the appropriate resources, to ensure that your team is the appropriate size and capability to really keep up with the growth of your business. And I have really seen this happen a lot with businesses that have very rapid growth through mergers, acquisitions. Overnight, you can all of a sudden double in size. Well, okay, great. You've doubled in size. Now you've added on, let's say, another 1,000 employees. Well, what did you do with your HR team? Probably absolutely nothing. And now your HR team has 1,000 more heads in your population, and there's a certain percentage of employee relations issues that are going to come with that. And you've got to have the analytics to support that. Yeah.
Yeah, what we find, investigation data is one of HR's richest but most underused assets. And ultimately, dashboards, they can surface trends, predict risks, and guide cultural change. And that's how HR moves from firefighter to foresight.
Right. Love it. All right. So for HR leaders who are listening, who want to build a truly data-informed employee relations strategy, what's one tip you would share with them before we close out our episode today?
It's a marathon, not a sprint. As mentioned previously, it's a journey. So don't just track volumes. Start associating resolution times, outcomes to it. Make data part of your quarterly and annual business reviews. And ultimately, as you mentioned, move from anecdotes to analytics.
Right. Love it. Jakub, this has been such an insightful discussion. And to quickly recap, strong documentation is essential for compliance and credibility. Securing evidence, it protects both employees and the organization. And AI is making investigations faster, smarter, and without replacing, of course, human judgment. It's given us some shortcuts. And the analytics are also giving HR leaders the power to move from reactive, to proactive. All right. So for our listeners who want to learn more about Case IQ, I'll tell you the best place to go is in the show notes. We've got a link there for you. And if there's any information that you would like from Jakub and his team, that will be there. All right. And I want to thank you, Jakub, for sharing your expertise with us today. And thanks to all of you for tuning in to the HR Investigations podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share it with a colleague, and check out more resources at rpchr.com. And I'm Natalie Ivy. I want to thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Be good, everybody.
Thanks for joining us today on the HR Investigations podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show with any colleagues who will benefit from our strategies and solutions. For free bonus resources, simply visit hr-investigations.com. And remember, if you'd like some help with improving your investigative skills, or if your organization is in need of an external investigator to help with a case, please get in touch with us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.